Welcome to The Fairer Sense.
With me, Tanya.
And me, Kara.
Women, money, and the fight to break even.
Because we give a shit. And you should too.
Today, part 2 of Breaking into the Boys Club. What up, Kara?
What is up, Tanya? We are back at it. Are you ready for part 2 of Women in the Boys Club?
It's a different thing to continue a topic into a second episode, but yeah, I'm totally fired up. And I'll just say to listeners, if you haven't already listened to part 1 of this, Breaking into the Boys Club part 1, the prior episode, please go listen to that one first and then come join us back over here.
Quick little recap. On the first episode, we looked at a woman in tech, friend of the podcast, Felicity, and a woman in the outdoors industry. So today we are going over the pond. We are hearing from a woman in England and a woman in South Africa today, both of whom are scientists and both of whom I had such a blast speaking with. They were amazing. They blew my mind, and I loved every second of our interviews.
Yeah, we certainly have plenty of things to talk about that are problems here in North America and barriers that women face, but I love that we're able to get a broader perspective and hear what some of these challenges are like, working in a workplace, dealing with academia, coming up through your own education in other countries where some of the socialization might be a little bit different or where the systems might be a bit different for advancement. So really excited to share these interviews.
Something that both of my interviews touched on was the fact that they went to single-sex schools for their lower education, what we would call elementary and middle and high school education. And that got me really thinking about how we educate people and how we educate specifically boys and girls. So I did a little bit of a deep dive into some stuff, and I want to share some statistics that I found.
Bring the stats, Kara.
So a study out of Israel from Victor Lavie at Hebrew University in Jerusalem and Analia Schlosser at Princeton found that no matter which way they measured it, and they measured over 280 schools, they found that the higher proportion of girls in a class, the better the results for everyone. So in mixed gendered schooling, if there are more girls in a class, everyone does better. However, in single gender schooling, boys do worse, and single gender girls schools, girls do way better, like markedly better than from mixed classes, which does not surprise me.
It tells us what we already knew, that girls are the best.
Yes, it just confirms what we already knew.
But I mean, it is a really interesting question. And certainly when you're talking about primary education or K-12, you're talking about forming and shaping young minds and doing some of that initial socialization that sticks with girls and boys and gender nonconforming students forever. And that's really something worth thinking about. The research also shows that girls who go to girls-only schools feel more assertive. They feel better at subjects that are traditionally thought of as quote unquote boy subjects. And that's a real positive. It's unfortunate that that comes at the cost of harming boys. And that sort of gets into some of the complications, because I think then when you get older and you get into the workplace, if we started trying to separate people into genders, that would feel incredibly discriminatory. And I know, like you and I, Kara, have had fights with people on Twitter who've said like, oh, I can't mentor young women as a man because people might get suspicious or it's too much liability. And we're like, shut the fuck up. That's bullshit. And like that to me makes this a really nuanced thing. It's like, at what age is it okay to separate students? At what age does it not become okay? What are the costs we're willing to take on to help girls get equal? Is it okay to sacrifice some of boys' progress? Like that doesn't feel right either. So I don't know what the solution is.
Yeah. And so another study that was done in England takes on that exact question, where it basically asks, should we be having mixed gendered schools at girls' expenses because it helps the boys, or should we be having single gendered schools because that's better for girls, even if the boys suffer? Spoiler alert, they don't come up with an answer to that. But what I thought was really interesting about the study is that one of the researchers had this to say. Certain boys dominate the classrooms in mixed situations. The sheer number of boys in some schools make it difficult. Girls take protective measures. They sit together separately. The more boys you have, the more equipment and teacher time they take up. So this to me is a really interesting intersection of education and socialization, because girls are taught to protect themselves, right? Like, watch what you're wearing, don't go out at night, you need to have your own back because the world is going to harm you. So what this was saying, girls take protective measures. They sit together separately. They sit together separately from the boys, so little like all girls tables, which allows them to thrive. And the boys are more demanding of the teacher's time, which means the girls get less of the teacher's time. Something else that this study said, research from London's Institute of Education found that girls who go to girls' schools will later earn more than those from mixed schools, partly because they are less likely to make gendered decisions about their studies and are therefore more likely to take maths and science subjects. First of all, quick hilarious note at maths with an S.
Maths.
Gotta love those Brits. So both the women I spoke to went to all girls schools, and they both made a note to me while we were talking of how they didn't really experience sexism as young girls, because when they went to their physics classroom, everyone in there was a girl. And so, of course, girls could be physicists, which was not my experience in high school. And I just thought that was really interesting.
We've talked before, like in the episode about financial feminism, about coming to an identity as a feminist and often that being a reaction to seeing more overt sexism happening. I have a very clear memory of 8th grade, a moment when, a little backstory, I was a total math nerd. I was one of those kids who was just really good at like fast thinking. And so I did a lot of math competitions, like the kind with the buzzer. And it was totally fun, but I often would win or get some award and they'd be announced during morning announcements at school. And so my vivid memory is of this 8th grade classroom. My name got announced as a winner, and this boy stood up and was like, "Oh, good job, little schoolgirl," and did all this like total bullshit stuff, frankly. And the teacher didn't say anything, which I kind of want to go back and like smack that teacher. But it completely changed how I saw those accomplishments. And it told me a lot of things, you know, like it's not good to be a girl who's smart at math. It's not good to stand out. It was very much like the tall poppy effect, you know, where they felt like they had to cut down the person who was getting more attention. And I'm not joking, but after that, I actually would show up late for school or be sick, quote unquote sick, on the days after I'd won a math competition because I didn't want to be sitting there when it got announced. Like, how fucked up is that?
I'm so sorry that happened to you. That is super fucked up.
Yeah. And so I went on to then be like an English major. I studied Shakespeare instead of doing more math and science stuff. And so I always think of that when they're like, why don't we have more women in STEM? I'm like, because of mean 8th grade boys.
Yeah, well, and I saw a cartoon once on my favorite site on the internet, Tumblr, which showed there's 2 stick figures at a whiteboard and they're doing an equation. And one of them says to the other one of them gets it wrong. The other one says, "Wow, you're so bad at math." And then in the next panel, same stick figures, only this time the other stick figure has gotten something wrong. And the other stick figure says, "Wow, girls are so bad at math," which I think I literally pulled it off Tumblr and I keep it on my desktop because that to me goes to the heart of this. And you'll hear from one of my interviewees later, she talks about this. What we need to change is not just getting more girls into science classes and thus into scientific careers or into mathematical careers. It's this idea that girls can't do something or girls' accomplishments deserve to be derided in front of the entire friggin' class or whatever. You know, we need to change the value that we place on girls and what it means to be female or female identifying. Girls are not always seen as individuals. Oh, Kara's bad at math. It's, well, Kara got this math problem wrong, therefore all girls are going to get this problem wrong. And we need to shift that mindset.
Also, the idea that by giving girls the opportunity to succeed and to thrive and to be socialized in a way that helps them, that we're somehow holding them back later in life. Like, I think for me, My dad never seriously considered putting me in an all-girls school, even though he thought that might be a good thing because he worried that I wouldn't be able to kind of like hang in the work world later on. But the fact that the research shows that women who attended all-girls school in K-12 go on to earn more tells us that that's not happening, that there is something powerful about single-sex education, at least for girls. And that's not the entirety of what we're talking about today. I think that's just one example of how this question is complicated, of how we break into the boys' club.
I spoke with Dr. Jess Wade, a PhD in physics who works at Imperial College London.
In scientific careers, you have people, you have these CEOs, you have senior people within universities, you have professors, and they're kind of celebrated as being absolutely brilliant, right? So society says this CEO, whatever they are, whether they're running an investment bank or whatever, they are the best person to do this job. They're absolutely so mega skilled and talented, they have to do it. And then that person will be employed by somewhere else because they have this track record of being there and having done this thing and, you know, being recognized as this big superstar. And the same thing happens with a professor. So somehow you get promoted to professor. But these people who are professors, who are obviously majority white men in subjects like physics and engineering, they then get employed to be a professor at a different university, or they get given all these privileges, like they can apply for more grants, they can do all of these different kinds of things because they've got this celebrated title as professor. And they're kind of taking up all the space, right? You can only have so many CEOs. A university can only have so many professors. And I feel like there's only so much room at the top. There are so many brilliant and diverse people below that top level. It's kind of like, let us in and let us try.
Can you tell us a little bit about getting your degree?
The majority of physicists that you meet, and especially the majority of women that you meet who are physicists, went to a single-sex school. So my school was an all-girls school when I was growing up, and most other physicists that I've met also went to all-girls schools. So I never had that kind of challenge of thinking, hey, maybe physics is a boys' subject. Maybe I shouldn't be doing maths and physics and subjects like that, because everyone around me was a girl, right? So they weren't going to say, oh, no, don't do that, because then no one would do that. And then I went to art school for a year before doing physics, which is pretty gender balanced, actually, unsurprisingly, for art school. And then I got to doing my physics degree also at Imperial. And I think at first it was so hard, such a massive jump up from being at school. And so I spent the first kind of few terms and then turned into a few years just working incredibly hard, kind of not talking to anyone and not paying attention to the gender of the people who may be sitting next to me in the lecture theatre. And then as I got progressively through the degree, and I stayed on to do this master's course, and there the gender imbalance suddenly struck me. And I kind of started noticing, hey, look at these professors around me. Maybe 1 in 10 of them is a woman. And that's a weird thing. And then it started to frustrate me more and more during my PhD. And I work in kind of experimental physics and device physics. The kind of freshness of this area of physics means that we've got a much better balance of men and women within this whole discipline. So subjects which have a massive gender imbalance are things like astrophysics. So historically, it's a very old subject. We've been doing it for a very, very long time. So I haven't directly experienced any sexism from anyone around me, and they've all been incredibly supportive and great. I think probably just the kind of pressures you get within society to take on different things, take on different roles within a group because you're a woman, have affected me. So arranging meetings, booking rooms, baking cakes for meetings, making sure everyone's okay all the time. That's the kind of thing that I know is happening to me, and it's probably happening to me because I'm a girl.
Recently in the US, there's been some chatter around emotional labor, and you're doing emotional labor in the workplace and probably not being compensated for it. And I think your point, the expectation, yeah, okay, well, we have to have a meeting. Who will book it? Well, a woman will make sure that we have the space. A woman will make sure that we have the snacks. And that's the kind of entrenched sexism that people don't really think about. They don't really acknowledge, but it is a huge issue.
You're promoted within universities for things like papers and grants and going around the world and giving talks at international conferences. The kind of whole process of peer review. I do some nice science. I write it up into a paper. I submit that paper to a journal. The journal then distributes that to other scientists all over the world who read the paper and review it and think, hey, is this good enough to publish in this journal? that's an incredibly biased whole process. The people who read the paper when they're reviewing it look at your name, they see that you're a woman, they're often very biased against women, they look at where you're from, they're very biased against certain countries. So that whole process is super biased against women. The other thing that's very biased against women is the whole process of applying for grants. So when you apply for big amounts of money to let you do research, it's the same process again. So some people peer review it. They never have to justify their comments. Really, that just has a huge impact on the career of the person who's applied for grants. And then the third thing that you kind of get evaluated on is student feedback on your teaching. And student feedback on teaching is incredibly biased against women in disciplines like physics and engineering and maths and computing. So all of those things kind of stack up to stop women from succeeding in science. And that's a massive problem because they're kind of silent, right? They're things that are very, very hard to challenge head on. You don't see it happening all the time. These are kind of secret emails that only go back and forth between very, very senior people. And then alongside that, you have the woman putting in all of this time to administrative tasks.
You set up Women in Physics at Imperial, and tell me a little bit about that and what you do.
Actually, within the university as a whole, we have an award scheme that celebrates universities' commitments to equality and diversity. And it's almost like saying universities are going to do lip service to equality and diversity work unless we make them get an award for it. So this was kind of established probably about 15, 20 years ago. And it's incredibly successful. It's really made universities stop and look at the numbers of people progressing, the kind of support that they offer to people, and the whole university in general, and try to make it more accessible to people who haven't otherwise been represented there. And I guess I started getting involved with kind of the Women in Physics movement because I was asked to join this group in the physics department who were writing their application for this award. We set up a postgraduate group. We go on little trips, we go to see talks. But when you're a woman isolated in a particular department, say I'm the only girl in my research group, or say I'm the only girl in my office, you very rarely see those people who look like you. Don't really see people who you can just have a chat with. There are some things that you just want to speak to other women about occasionally. And so we have regular lunches. We've called them kind of safe space lunches because I think they're a space where you can go and not be judged. And this is really important in something like academia because it is phenomenally competitive. And it's really nice to have a space where you can go along and just say, this is quite difficult, or being in this situation, being the only one who's saying this one idea in a particular meeting, or, my voice is a completely different frequency and pitch to everyone else. Sometimes that makes experiments behave weirdly, and I feel really uncomfortable about that. I think that the most incredible male professors, and say white professors if it's for people of color or something like that, I think they're the ones who come in and say, I've got this privilege and I'm going to use it to make this experience better for you. And there are definitely those people across Imperial.
So tell me about your Wikipedia editing, because you're pretty active on Twitter, which we love. We're also very active on Twitter. Just tell me about that project you're doing.
Very important for me. So Wikipedia is incredibly biased. English-speaking Wikipedia is incredibly biased about the gender of the biography pages. So if you've ever been on Wikipedia, which I'm sure you have because it comes up every time you try and Google anything, main contributors are men. They basically, as we've been talking about, write content that they feel comfortable with. And it's also a lot of pages about other men. And in science, that's obviously particularly bad because the majority of scientists, historical scientists, were also men. And there are various rules on Wikipedia about what makes a subject notable and whether someone's worthy to even be on Wikipedia. Those rules were also written by men. So you have this kind of perpetuating collection of awful things that means that the world's most accessed encyclopedia is very, very biased. And that's a problem because young people don't use books as much as we used to. They don't use textbooks as much as we used to. They get a huge amount of their kind of understanding about the world from Wikipedia. And if the creators and the content on that site are so biased, then we're going to have very, very biased young minds. And so I started editing Wikipedia about a year ago. Something like stirred in me. And I was like, actually, you know what? It's time I started actually doing this. I can edit a few things here and there. So this year I've been making a page about a new woman every day, or someone from another underrepresented group. So maybe it's an African American scientist, maybe it's an actual African scientist working on a really, really cool kind of thing. But basically, I find cool scientists from all over the world. And if they don't have a Wikipedia page, first I spend about 5 minutes getting very angry at the injustice in the world and how can they not be recognized? And they've won this incredibly significant award. And then I think, hey, I can actually do something to change this. And I make their Wikipedia page.
I think that's such a smart way to take on an institutional problem. The actress Gina Rodriguez, who stars in Jane the Virgin, uses her Instagram, which has like 3 million followers or something. Every Monday, she does something called Movement Monday, where she features a person of color who is working in arts. So it can be an actor, a singer, musician of some sort, but it's a person of color and she uses her platform to showcase them, which I just think is so wonderful. And I heard her speak about it, and she said, working in Hollywood, a lot of people will say, oh, well, I just can't find a woman of color for that role, so I have to default to white woman. Like, wah, wah. Like, I want to do this, but I can't. And Gina was like, fuck that. They're out here. You're just not looking for them. So she was like, I'm going to put them on my Instagram. You can't say you don't see them now. Do you talk with your coworkers about things like salary and things like the pay gap, and particularly your male coworkers?
So, disclosure, all of my coworkers ever have been men. I've never been in a group, like close research group, that's ever had a woman. I think science is a really interesting one to talk about a gender pay gap in, because it's very hard in science. It's very transparent when you apply for the job how much you're going to be paid. So far in kind of my very basic early career as a scientist, I have never had cause to think that I'm being paid differently to the men around me. I think that further up, it becomes less and less transparent about what's going on. And that's when I think people have these really they don't have those uncomfortable conversations, which is why when the UK had to start reporting its gender pay gap recently, it was so shocking to everyone quite how big that is. And I think, as with every career, and I'm sure you've spoken about it before, it's because men are very, very keen and very, very quick to ask for promotions and to ask for bonuses and to ask for increases on their salary, much more so than women are. And I spoke to an academic once, and she said that when she applied for kind of a tenure track, a tenured position within the university, she came down for the interview, she had it. They called her on the way back to say that she'd got the position and to explain what the contract was. And obviously that's a sign that they're super keen, right? They call you while you're on the way back from the interview. And they said, oh, this is how much you're being paid. And she was so excited. She just said, oh, yeah, that's so great. And then kind of hung up the phone and didn't stick around to kind of argue for more money. And when I've spoken to male colleagues about applying for jobs, they always argue for more money, right? They say like, oh, this is how much I'm on here, or this is how much it's going to cost me to live in London or whatever. And they always push it. And I would never think to push it. And I know that this quite senior academic who I told the story about just now didn't push it.
So, as you know, we have monetized this podcast, and we strive to work with sponsors that have the same values that we do. We're not taking money from people who punch puppies and fire women for getting pregnant.
One such cool company is Autoslash. Raise your hand if you've ever rented a car and hated the experience. Oh my God, I have so many times. But Autoslash makes it better. They figure out the best coupons and discount codes to get you the lowest rate possible, and then track prices on your rental right up until the day you pick up the car.
If they find a lower rate, they email you so you can lock in the savings. And it's the #1 site for cheap car rentals, so it's perfect for anyone trying to save money. And Autoslash works with all the major rental companies like Hertz, Avis, and Thrifty. Plus, super awesome bonus, renters save an average of 30% or more when they use Autoslash.
Since they track coupons before you book and compare rates after you book, Autoslash ensures you get the best deal. Save yourself the time and the money by letting them do the heavy lifting. Head to autoslash.com to check out some of their deals today.
I also spoke with Kimberly Tomy from South Africa. She has her master's in paleoanthropology and, as she described it, functional morphology, which, if that's not the most badass thing in the world, I honestly don't know what is. We spoke a lot about how our systems need to change to make spaces more welcoming for women.
So I get to look at all of the cool fossil hominins from South Africa. I don't know if you know, but South Africa has one of the richest fossil records in all the world. We have a record of the very beginning of life, first stages of the transition from sea to land. Got a good fossil record of dinosaurs, mammal evolution, and I spend my days looking at the bones of these species and trying to figure out how it is they started walking upright.
I wanted to talk to you a little bit about the process of getting your degree. And here on this podcast, we talk a lot about the challenges that women face in certain fields. So, when you were getting your master's, were there a lot of other women in your program?
So I think there's been quite a shift in paleosciences, especially here in South Africa, I would say, compared to a few years ago. So in my master's, there were, well, I had started a bit later, and I was kind of alone. But there tends to be quite a balance when it comes to men and women. But I would say that we do have a little bit of a struggle with retaining women. So often we see quite an influx of young women coming into what is known as your honors year, which is just a year after your undergraduate. And we've seen numbers, a lot of women come into it. But keeping these women until a PhD, that has proven to be quite a difficulty, especially women of color. So we are a predominantly Black country. We do have a large population of Black and what is known as colored people in South Africa, but we make up the minority of women and academics in general in our universities.
Yeah, it's sort of the same here in the States. The studies show that really young kids, boys and girls, show the same aptitude and the same interest in science and math. And then once they get to high school, it becomes overwhelmingly boys who show interest in it and girls stop expressing interest in science and math. But it's because of really the social training that we have and the images that we see of male doctors and male scientists and boys being told you're good at math and girls being told you're good at writing. And so by the time women reach university, and especially going on to masters and PhDs, the numbers of men pursuing science based degrees and women pursuing science based degrees, there's a huge discrepancy. Like, how do you think your program and other programs can retain women better?
Well, like you were saying, it's not that the love for it isn't there, it's kind of the conditioning. I mean, I went to an all girls school for high school, and they never kind of restricted us. I think also partially because there weren't boys in our environment, that we all took the physics and the science, and they encouraged girls to be engineers and to go into the sciences. And I think that's also because then there's not that forced kind of bias that tends to creep up in education systems. I think there has to be a mindset change, because what's happening is we see women coming into these environments that aren't really friendly towards women. So you come into it with all of these expectations, and you're ready to work, but essentially you're forced out of it, either because it is predominantly male and the people who sit in power are male, and they make decisions that benefit what they are comfortable with and what they are familiar with. So I find that that's a big problem. Is like we enter these fields, but there's no senior females in positions. That's something that really needs to change. Another thing is just the mindset in general, that there's women are treated differently in a space. You're not kind of considered an equal. You need to work twice as hard to be considered an equal. There's gaps in pay. We don't make the same amount of money as men. But something I've picked up on, just a small example, discussions about children. When a man leaves an office to go and fetch his child, he's the father of the year. If a woman has to leave a meeting because there's an emergency with her children, it's the complete opposite. She's seen as weak or not serious, doesn't take her job seriously if having kids is important to her. There's just all of these intricate underlying issues that bring hostility into the workplace.
I wanted to touch on the pay gap that you mentioned. That's a really big thing in the United States, and it gets a lot of attention, but it's very persistent. So even though people know women make less than men, we haven't been able to close the gap. Is that a conversation that's happening in South Africa on a national scale?
So it's not something that's really discussed, I would say, openly in South Africa. We do have a lot of gender-based issues. So we have a lot of issues facing our country. We have a high rate of femicide. It's actually quite a shocking rate as it stands. And there's just, I think that because of all of the violent crime against women, the gender gap in terms of pay has not been something that is extremely it's not at the forefront of the discussion in the public forums, but it's definitely something that should be brought up, because we constantly are asking ourselves why it is that we don't see women in certain fields, or women tend to leave certain fields. And this is definitely one of the issues.
The pay gap is a symptom of a larger problem, and the larger problem is sexism, right? And so if we can work on our sexist systems and our sexist thoughts and our sexist behaviors, that will help fix things like the pay gap. And I think it's important for women to advocate for themselves and to know, okay, I am, a scientist, a doctor, a writer, whatever it is. I'm worth X amount of money. But when you're fighting a sexist system, you can have all the facts and figures on your side, and it's still a sexist system. You obviously love your job, and you obviously feel really passionate about your field of study. What would you say to a woman who's listening right now, who's thinking about going into science? Do you have any sort of words of encouragement or advice to women who want to pursue a science career, knowing that it's going to be difficult at times?
When it comes to this question, I always think, what would I have wanted to hear when I was in my teens, or when I just entered university and I was still a bit confused about what it is I wanted to do with my life. I think that it's important, firstly, of course, that we're not going to solve all of the problems now. As the women who are currently in these fields, I think we try our best in any small way to make any dent, but this is a system that's been in place for hundreds of years, where it's just a patriarchal society, and it's kind of male dominated fields. And science is one of them that really suffers from that. But I think advice to a younger person trying to come into this would be, never listen to people when they tell you your place is somewhere, or that you are only capable of achieving this much. Because often I find that negativity has roots in fear. So it will be people who are afraid to see what you could achieve or what you are capable of doing.
I decided to look up the Nobel Prizes to see what the history has been like. And if you just Google right now, Nobel Prize winners, you'll see all the winners from this past year, 2017. I was going to say, guess how many white dudes it is, but you already know the answer. It's almost 100% white guys, most with very Western sounding names, with the exception of a Japanese man in literature and an organization for the Peace Prize. And if you go back, the Nobel Prizes in physics, it's pretty much a similar story. It's a lot of men. There is definitely a tiny bit more diversity there. There are, in particular, some Asian men on the list, but it's a space where it's definitely the definition, I think, of the boys' club. Even if in college or in graduate work, there are a lot of women there, the higher levels are almost exclusively men.
Yeah, and this goes really to the heart of why we wanted to do 2 episodes on this. Because really what fundamentally needs to shift is, like I've said, our value system. In the United States, in elementary school, girls show the same aptitude and the same interest in science and math, and then that peters out as they age. And that comes directly into play with how we socialize, with when we look at the image of a doctor on television. Is it McDreamy? Is it just a white dude? Or are we seeing more Meredith Greys? Are we able to see more Sandra Ohs playing doctors? That's going to color how girls are internalizing messages of what can I be when I grow up? What areas am I welcome in? What areas can I thrive in? And that's why I found it so interesting, the all-girl school statistics of girls that do go to all-girl schools making more money because they don't have those gendered expectations.
This is definitely an intersectional moment in terms of who we see as appropriate to fill certain roles. It's, I think, still a little bit revolutionary that Neil deGrasse Tyson is one of the major faces in science right now in terms of famous scientists, because forever it's always been white guys who have been seen as the ones who do science. Speaking of a little diversity, though, I have found two women who've won the Nobel Prize. One was Marie Curie, of course, in the 1900s, the aughts of that century. And then Maria Goeppert-Mayer won it in 1963 for their discoveries concerning nuclear shell structure, but not finding many others.
I mean, shout out to you ladies. I just think, man, and it's like what Dr. Wade said, where how she spends her spare time creating Wikipedia entries for female scientists because she knows the power of representation. I mean, here's somebody who, and we will link to an article, actually, The Guardian did an article on how she does this with her spare time, to be able to say, yeah, women have been in science throughout history. We just don't remember them the same way. We don't reward them in the same way, but they've been here. And I read this short article about, I hope I'm saying this name correctly, Agnetus. She was an ancient Greek physician. And for a long time, she was believed to have been a myth, but they actually have found evidence that she really existed. And she was a physician who dressed up as a man in order to be able to practice. And she was so good at what she did that men brought her to court. They sued her because they thought that this doctor was sleeping with their wives. That's why all the women wanted to go to him. And she stripped down naked in court and was like, I'm not sleeping with your wives. I'm just a lady and I'm just that good at everything. And she's been largely written out of history. So it's not that women haven't been here, it's that they haven't been remembered. And so for Dr. Wade to be spending her spare time creating these Wikipedia entries about women across the world, across different sciences, that to me is so amazing and helps give the future generation of female scientists role models to look up to.
I think that's such an important point. Like, I think about the movie Bombshell that is out now on Netflix. That's the Hedy Lamarr story. She was an American film actress in the 30s, 40s, and 50s and was thought of as one of the great screen beauties, but she also played an instrumental role in creating the technology that allowed the US military and the Allies to guide torpedoes, which ultimately led to the development of our current technology for Bluetooth. And this was someone who was an actress, which, if there's anyone we can agree is given total credit for their intellectual capacity, it's definitely actresses. That was sarcasm. It's so great to see now her story being told. It sucks massively that her story wasn't told during her lifetime when she could actually be lauded for her achievements, and it's only being told now. But, this is an important thing. We need to kind of resurrect some of the past and tell those stories because, as we talked about last week, there is often this token effect. And if you're the only woman in the room or you're the only woman on a corporate board, it's hard to speak up if you feel like you're having to speak for all women, or if you're worried about being seen and judged as representing all women or all people of color or any marginalized group. But if you know that there have been other people doing what you're doing who've broken the ground for you, that is a lot better, and that helps. Even if you can't have them in the room with you, it's still important to know that they're out there or that they've been here.
And you might be asking yourself, okay, ladies, but how does this tie into money? And to me, it's so clear, but it might not be clear. But here's the thing. If we don't value women as being equal to men just on the face, what we find is that also impacts their money. For example, there's a New York Times article literally entitled, "As Women Take Over a Male-Dominated Field, the Pay Drops." And we will link to this in the show notes. But what it essentially said is as women enter fields that have been traditionally dominated by men, pay goes down. Women are still underpaid, even though they're in the air quotes higher paying fields. And then pay overall drops for that. And that role loses status, which is absolutely bonkers. My favorite word on this podcast. But the underlying, to go back to what Dr. Tomy and I said, is the underlying issue there is not so much that you don't have the right degree or that you didn't study the right thing. It's that we don't think work done by women is important.
I think it's important to say this isn't just an issue in science-related fields. Like I think about law. It has been almost 30 years now, since 1992, that women have been half of law school attendees and law school graduates. So 92, that's 26 years ago. That is the length of most of a career for a lot of people. And so those women who were going in equal numbers and coming out in equal numbers are now very, very senior. And yet, we still have a situation in which only 36% of federal judges are women. You would expect to see parity, especially at that point in people's careers, if the gender parity holds, but it doesn't. And you see, we talk a lot about underrepresentation on the Supreme Court. I mean, it's sort of at every level and at almost every field, even those that are heavily female in the lower levels, you don't see that translate into leadership. Like CEO percentages are, there's a reason why most people picture a white guy. Like that's who most CEOs are, even though women have been going to college in large numbers since the 60s. So this is something that absolutely affects our money. Like if you say to all women, this is the glass ceiling all the way, like you can advance, but only up to a certain point. Also, when you join a field, we're going to pay everybody less, but you're never going to be able to get to those top levels. That is 100% money.
100%.
This is so funny. We were going back and rewatching the Bo Burnham stand-up specials on Netflix because he did an interview on Fresh Air with Terry Gross, which you should totally listen to. And the movie he made, 8th Grade, it sounds pretty awesome. I'm excited to see it. But one of the things that he talks about in the special Make Happy is the idea, and granted, like he's a white male all the way, but he also talks a lot about that and acknowledges the privilege that comes with that. But he says, we pretend like this is a meritocracy, or we pretend like you can do anything. That's what we promise kids, when in reality you can't. And it's a lie. And I feel that in a big way. It's like if we're in fact saying to women, you can't do anything. You're never going to reach the upper levels of your chosen field. You can get to a certain point, but beyond that, it's not available to you, or it will only be available to this tiny fraction of the most special women. That would feel more honest. Not that I think we want to hold children back or, get into limiting beliefs, but I do think what we tell people and what we promise children is not an accurate representation of what then they actually face in the world.
Yeah. I completely agree with Bo and thus you. It does feel awful to say to a kid, especially, you can't be that, but it's far more accurate. I think the way to be able to say to a child, you can do anything you want, is to start making it possible for adults to do anything they want. And a lot of that starts with pay. The more money you have, the more freedom you have. Ask anyone in the FIRE community, that's all they want. They want to save up a bunch of money so they can control their time more.
And I think tying all of this back to some of the conclusions that we got to in part 1 of this topic of breaking into the boys club, if we have more women throughout organizations and in leadership roles, we're more likely to catch what we'd call like the stupid idiot mistakes, like the iPhone seeing all Asian women as interchangeable with the face recognition and phone unlocking. But we'd also just see better products that appeal to a broader range of people. We as consumers would have better choices. We'd also, I think, totally seems rational to me that we would have better science if we have more women in scientific leadership roles, because they're going to bring a different perspective to things. It's not that girls are better, although sometimes we think they are, but that just anytime you can broaden the perspectives, ultimately the end product is going to be better. And in the case of science, that's something that benefits us all in society, in addition to benefiting us as women and our money.
Co-signed.
Having been through now 2 parts of this topic, I feel like we could probably do like a 7-part series on breaking into the boys club. So as usual, we have just scratched the surface. I think if we were ever going to try to pretend like we could tackle a whole topic in an hour-long podcast, or even in 2 of them, we would be lying to you. These issues have deep roots, and they take a lot of thought to think about all the nuances.
There are just so many forces at work with this specific issue, as well as everything else we bring up on this podcast. So we hope we've given you something to think about. And I would really love to hear from people about their workplace experiences. We've gotten a few emails from listeners describing some of their workplace experiences, and I just always want to hear more. I've never had a traditional job, so it's super interesting to me. So you can always shoot us an email at fairsense@gmail.com, or you can tweet at us at fairsense.
I want to give a shout out to all the women out there working in male-dominated fields. We see you. We see how hard you're working. We see the extra effort it takes to thrive in that environment. And hopefully, little by little, we can all talk about this more and spread the word and beat some of this down, burn it with fire. So if you feel inspired by today's show or any of our episodes, we'd love if you'd go and listen to all our episodes. You can also leave a review, especially if you use iTunes. We love those star reviews. We read them all. We text each other about them. We love it. And we'd also appreciate it so much if you'd tell a friend about the Fair Sense.
Yeah, grab your raddest friend, tell them about us, and then together, stay rad.
Stay rad. The Fairer Sense are me, Tanya Hester, and the world's best co-host, Kara Perez. Our theme song is by The Insider, our ad music is by Kevin MacLeod, and you can find out more info about the other artists you hear on the show at our website, thefairersense.com. You can always find me at ournextlife.com and Kara at bravelygo.co.